The rain had been falling all afternoon, a slow, steady drizzle that painted the streets in silver streaks. Maria stood by the small kitchen stove, stirring a pot of chicken soup that had already begun to cool. Her swollen belly pressed against the counter, each movement a reminder that her son could arrive at any moment. She glanced at the wall clock, 8:17 p.m. Daniel should have been home hours ago. With one hand on her lower back, Maria reached for her phone and dialed his number. The first call went to voicemail. The second rang for what felt like a century before a clipped male voice answered. "What is it now?" Daniel's tone was impatient, his voice muffled by the sound of clinking glasses and music in the background. Her free hand clenched the phone tighter. "Daniel, I think it's time. My contractions are getting stronger, closer together. I need you to come home, please." There was a pause, not the pause of concern, but of annoyance. "Maria, I told you I had a business dinner tonight. Can't you just call a cab? I'll come by the hospital later." She blinked, stunned by his casual dismissal. "A cab? I can barely walk. What if something happens on the way?" "I'm busy," he said flatly. "Don't make this dramatic, you'll be fine." And just like that, the line went dead. The contraction hit hard, doubling her over. Maria gritted her teeth, breathing in short, shallow bursts the way the nurse had taught her during prenatal classes. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air. She'd known Daniel's love for her had been fading for months, ever since Sabrina appeared on the scene, but she hadn't expected his absence to be so cruelly timed. She reached for her overnight bag, packed weeks ago with baby clothes, diapers, and a faded blue blanket her mother had knit before passing away. As she zipped it shut, another contraction gripped her, this one sharper, pulling a low cry from her throat. It took her nearly 10 minutes to shuffle down the hallway and lock the apartment door behind her. The air outside smelled of wet asphalt. She flagged down the first taxi she saw, sliding into the back seat and giving the driver the hospital address. The driver kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his eyes flicking to her belly, then back to the road. "First baby?" he asked cautiously. Maria nodded, clutching the seat belt across her chest. "Yes, and I think he's in a hurry." They reached St. Augustine's Hospital in under 15 minutes, the tires hissing over puddles. By the time she stepped inside, she was drenched from the dash across the parking lot. The bright fluorescent lights of the emergency entrance felt harsh after the muted darkness outside. A nurse at the reception desk looked up immediately. "How far apart are your contractions?" "About 5 minutes," Maria managed between breaths. Within seconds, she was in a wheelchair, her bag on her lap, being pushed toward the maternity ward. The nurse asked for her husband's name, and Maria hesitated before answering. "Daniel Cruz, he's on his way." She couldn't bring herself to admit the truth, not yet. As they wheeled her past the polished corridors, she noticed a man in blue overalls mopping the floor near the nurse's station. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with silver streaks in his hair and a kind, weathered face. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, not out of curiosity, but concern. The nurse pushed her into a small labor room, the walls painted a pale yellow meant to be calming, but instead feeling sterile and cold. "The doctor will be in shortly," the nurse said, and left. Maria sank back against the pillows, her wet hair sticking to her cheeks. She tried to steady her breathing. She could do this. She had to do this. But the room felt too empty, too quiet. Somewhere down the hall, she heard muffled laughter, male and female voices, echoing in the distance. For a fleeting second, she wondered if Daniel was out there, but she knew better. Another contraction surged through her. She gripped the bedrails, shutting her eyes against the wave of pain. When she opened them again, the door was half open. The janitor from the hall stood there, mop in hand. His eyes were gentle, but there was something else in them too, recognition. "You work here sometimes, don't you?" he asked softly. Maria blinked, surprised. "I clean the offices a few evenings a week, yes." He stepped inside slowly, leaving the mop against the wall. "I thought so. I remember you always saying good evening to everyone, even me. Not everyone does that." Another contraction tore through her, and she bit back a groan. Without hesitation, he pulled a chair closer to her bed. "Do you need me to call someone?" Maria shook her head. Her throat felt tight. "No, he's not coming." The man didn't pry. He just sat there, hands resting on his knees, as if silently offering to be a wall she could lean on if needed. Through the haze of pain, Maria realized something. She wasn't afraid of him. Not even a little. In fact, in that moment, this stranger in a janitor's uniform felt like the only steady thing in her collapsing world. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the night was just beginning. The steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the small room, a cold reminder that Maria's body was on a countdown. The contractions were coming faster now, 3 minutes apart. She gripped the thin blanket and tried to breathe the way she'd been taught, but her breaths came ragged, shallow. The janitor, Miguel, she remembered his name now, stayed seated at her side. His presence was quiet but grounding, like an anchor in the storm. A nurse bustled in, clipboard in hand. "All right, Maria, I need your husband's ID and insurance details." Maria swallowed. He's not here yet." The nurse's pen paused mid-note. She gave a tight smile. "All right, we'll sort it later." But her eyes flicked briefly toward Miguel before she left the room. Down the hall, Maria could hear the faint sound of laughter. Not the friendly kind, the careless, self-indulgent kind. Somewhere in her gut, she knew it was Daniel's voice, but it reminded her of where he probably was at that very moment. Leaning across a candlelit table toward Sabrina, spinning lies about being trapped in a loveless marriage. Miguel shifted in his seat. "Do you want me to call him for you?" Maria shook her head quickly. "No, it won't change anything." Her voice cracked on the last word. Miguel didn't press. Instead, he reached for the pitcher of water on the bedside table and poured her a cup, holding it steady as she drank. "You're strong," he said simply, as if it were a fact, not an attempt at comfort. A particularly sharp contraction tore through her, pulling her forward. She gasped, clutching the side rail. Miguel's hand was suddenly there, warm, firm, holding hers. "I've seen a lot of women go through this alone," he said quietly. When she passed giving birth to our daughter, I promised myself I wouldn't let anyone else face it without someone there." Maria blinked through the tears the pain had forced from her eyes. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "Don't be. Life gave me a daughter. She's grown now. But I know what it means to have someone stay, even if they can't fix it." The next hour blurred into a rhythm. Contraction, Miguel's steady voice, brief moments of rest. Nurses came and went, checking monitors and jotting notes, occasionally casting curious glances toward the janitor who refused to leave. In the sterile hallway outside, life went on. Wheels squeaked over linoleum. An intercom crackled overhead. Someone laughed too loudly at a joke. But inside this room, the world had narrowed to Maria's ragged breathing and the quiet hum of Miguel's presence. Then the door swung open again. A nurse stepped in, pushing a small tray. "Doctor will be here shortly," she announced. Her eyes fell on Miguel. "Sir, are you the father?" Maria opened her mouth to explain, but Miguel answered first. "No, ma'am, just here for her." The nurse gave him a slow once-over, as though deciding whether to shoo him out. But something in Maria's gaze must have stopped her, because she left without another word. When the contraction eased, Maria glanced at Miguel. "You don't have to stay, you know. I'm sure you have work to do." "I am doing my work," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Just not the kind they pay me for." A lump formed in her throat. Daniel had once told her she was lucky he provided for her, that love was shown through bank transfers and credit cards. But here was a man with nothing to give her except his time and his steadiness, and somehow it was worth more. The hours ticked by. Daniel never called, not once. Maria felt another contraction claw through her body, stronger than before, and she gritted her teeth until her jaw ached. Her vision blurred at the edges. Miguel stood immediately, pressing the call button. "She's in pain," he told the nurse who answered. "Real pain." Within minutes, the room filled with motion. The doctor arrived, gloves snapping, instructions being given. Maria clung to Miguel's hand, too far into the haze to care how it looked to anyone else. As they wheeled her toward the delivery room, Miguel kept pace beside the gurney. And for the first time that night, Maria felt like she might actually make it through, not because Daniel would show up, but because this quiet, unexpected stranger had. Bright lights flooded Maria's vision as the gurney burst through the double doors of the delivery ward. The antiseptic scent was stronger here, and the hum of machines underscored every movement. Nurses moved with precision, checking monitors, adjusting IV lines, laying out instruments. Miguel kept pace at her side, his expression calm but alert, as though he'd stepped into a role he'd played before. "All right, Maria," the doctor said, glancing at her chart. "We're close now. I'll need you to push when I say so." A contraction hit violent, deep, ripping through her like a wave. She clutched Miguel's hand, her nails digging into his skin, but he didn't flinch. "That's it," he murmured, leaning closer so only she could hear. "Breathe. In through your nose, hold, now out." His voice cut through the chaos, a steady metronome in the storm. The doctor's voice rose over the beeping machines. "Push." Maria bore down, every muscle in her body screaming. Pain blurred her vision, but she heard Miguel's quiet encouragement in her ear, not loud, not dramatic, but constant. Somewhere in the haze, the thought of Daniel drifted in like an unwanted shadow. She imagined him in some dimly lit restaurant, wine glass in hand, while she lay here split open and alone. No, not alone. Miguel's hand was there. Miguel's voice was there. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Sweat dampened Maria's hairline, her hospital gown clung to her back, and still she pushed. "You're almost there," the doctor urged. Miguel's grip tightened. "One more, you've got this." And then a sharp, piercing cry. Maria's head fell back against the pillow, tears spilling down her temples. The sound of her baby's first breath shattered something inside her, something she hadn't realized she'd been holding together. A nurse placed the tiny, squirming bundle on her chest. Warmth bloomed instantly beneath her trembling hands. "Hello," she whispered, her voice breaking. Miguel stepped back, giving her space, but Maria caught his gaze. In the fluorescent light, his eyes were tired but kind and proud, though the child wasn't his. The doctor's voice broke the moment. "We'll need to run some quick checks. It'll just be a minute." The nurse lifted the baby gently and carried them to a nearby station. Maria felt suddenly empty, not just physically, but in a way she couldn't explain. The adrenaline was fading, leaving exhaustion and the heavy knowledge that Daniel still wasn't there. Miguel noticed. He leaned on the bed rail. "You did it," he said softly. "Your little one's here healthy. That's what matters right now." Maria swallowed hard. "You shouldn't have to be the one telling me that." He shrugged. "Life doesn't always give the right people the right moments. Sometimes it gives them to whoever's willing to show up." A lump rose in her throat. "You showed up." The nurse returned, placing the baby back in her arms. "Everything looks good. Congratulations, Mama." Maria cradled the tiny form, feeling the rise and fall of their breaths against her chest. Miguel watched, and for a fleeting moment, he imagined how different his life might have been if his own wife had lived through childbirth. But he pushed the thought away. This wasn't about him. The room began to quiet. Nurses filed out, the doctor gave a final nod, and the beeping of machines settled into a steady background rhythm. Miguel reached for his jacket. "I'll let you rest. You don't need some old janitor hanging around now." Maria looked up sharply. "Don't." He paused. "Don't call yourself just a janitor," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "Not tonight, not after what you did." Miguel gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "All right, not tonight." As he turned to leave, the door swung open. Daniel stood there, hair slicked back, shirt half untucked, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and wine. His eyes darted to Miguel, then to Maria holding the baby. "What's going on here?" Daniel demanded. "Who's he?" Miguel glanced at Maria. For the first time all night, she felt no urge to explain herself to Daniel. Instead, she held her child closer. "This is the man who stayed." Daniel's mouth tightened, but before he could speak, the doctor stepped back into the room. "Ah, Mr. Janitor's wife," he said absent-mindedly, looking at Daniel. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Daniel's eyes flickered with confusion, then something uglier, humiliation. Miguel didn't correct the doctor, neither did Maria. And in that quiet, Maria realized something that would change everything. Daniel could leave again tomorrow, or the next day, or a year from now. But tonight, the person who mattered most to her and her child was already here. Daniel's jaw tightened, the muscle in his cheek twitching as the doctor's words hung in the air like smoke. "Mr. Janitor's wife," he repeated slowly, his tone carrying a blend of disbelief and insult. His gaze snapped to Miguel. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Miguel remained by the door, his posture relaxed, hands in the pockets of his faded work pants. "It means," he said evenly, "that I was here when she needed someone, that's all." Daniel's nostrils flared. You think you can just step into my wife's life because you mop a few floors in this hospital." Maria's fingers tightened instinctively around the baby, the warmth of their tiny body anchoring her in the storm. She could feel her pulse quickening, but not out of fear, out of something sharper. Disgust. Miguel didn't rise to the bait. "I'm not here to step into anything. I was here because you were." Daniel's eyes darted to Maria, perhaps expecting her to jump to his defense. She didn't. She adjusted the blanket around the baby's head, her voice cool. "He's right," she said simply. "You were." Daniel took a step toward the bed, lowering his voice as though the quiet would somehow soften the blow of his words. "Maria, I had a business dinner, a big one. I couldn't just walk out." She looked up at him, her eyes unwavering. "I was in labor, Daniel, not shopping for curtains." The silence between them was brittle, ready to shatter. Miguel shifted, clearly debating whether to leave them alone, but Maria caught his sleeve as he passed. "Stay." Daniel's gaze darkened. "So that's it. You've decided you're taking his side." "This isn't about sides," Maria replied. "It's about showing up when it matters, and tonight you didn't." Daniel laughed without humor, the sound sharp and bitter. "You think this janitor cares about you? He's here because it makes him feel like a hero. Wait until he gets tired of playing babysitter." Miguel's voice stayed level, but his eyes hardened. "You don't know me, and I'm not here for thanks or pity or to replace anyone. I'm here because a woman was in pain and alone, and I couldn't walk past that." Maria saw something flicker in Daniel's expression, not guilt, but annoyance at being outnumbered. "You've changed," he muttered, as though the accusation might sting. Maria almost laughed. "No, Daniel, I've just stopped pretending you'll be the man I need you to be." The baby stirred, letting out a soft cry, and Maria instinctively rocked them, her voice softening for the first time since Daniel walked in. "You should meet your child." Daniel hesitated, as though unsure whether to take the offer as an olive branch or a trap. He stepped closer, peering down. "They've got your nose," he said finally, a faint smile tugging at his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Miguel caught the shift in Daniel's stance, the slight forward lean, the tightening of his shoulders. Years of working in a hospital had taught Miguel to recognize tension before it broke. "You should rest, Maria," Miguel said quietly, stepping between the bed and Daniel. "Visiting hours are almost over." Daniel bristled. "She's my wife." "And she's just given birth," Miguel replied, his voice calm but immovable. "If you care about her at all, you'll give her peace right now." For a moment it looked like Daniel might push back, but the fight drained from his face, replaced with a cold smile. "Fine, I'll be back tomorrow, we'll talk then." Maria didn't respond. She simply adjusted the baby in her arms, her attention wholly on them, as though Daniel had already left. When the door closed behind him, the air in the room seemed lighter. Miguel lingered by the wall, not wanting to intrude on the quiet moment between mother and child. "Thank you," Maria said after a while, her voice softer now. "Not just for tonight, for not letting him turn this into a scene." Miguel shrugged lightly. "You've been through enough scenes for one night." She smiled faintly, though her eyes were tired. "You should go get some rest too." "I will," he said, "but I'll be around just in case." As he left, Maria watched the door close and realized something strange. She wasn't afraid of tomorrow. Not because Daniel had changed, but because she had. Daniel's shoes clicked sharply against the hospital's polished floor as he strode toward the elevator. His reflection in the chrome doors looked every bit the successful man he told the world he was. Tailored suit, silk tie, hair slicked into place. But the face staring back was tight with frustration. Miguel. The name had been gnawing at him from the moment the doctor used it. Mr. Janitor's wife. The phrase replayed in Daniel's head with an ugly echo. It wasn't just the humiliation. It was the insinuation that this man, this hospital floor mopper, had been more of a husband to Maria in the past 12 hours than Daniel had in years. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to his contact list. A name popped up. Victor Sloan, a private investigator he'd used once before for a messy business dispute. If anyone could dig up dirt on a janitor, it was Victor. By the time Daniel reached his car, Victor was already on the line. "I need you to find out everything you can about a guy named Miguel. Works as a janitor at St. Joseph's Hospital. Start tonight." Victor chuckled on the other end. "You paying me rush rates?" "Just do it," Daniel snapped, tossing his phone into the passenger seat. Miguel, meanwhile, was walking down a different hallway, his shift technically over but his mind still in Maria's room. The sound of her voice, steady, unafraid, lingered with him. It wasn't the first time he'd seen a woman abandoned in labor, but it was the first time the abandonment had cut this deep for someone he barely knew. As he passed the nurse's station, a voice called out, "Hey, Miguel." It was Dr. Patel, the same one who had delivered Maria's baby. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I didn't say it in front of her husband, but the way you were there for her, that's rare. You didn't have to stay." Miguel shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "Someone once stayed for me. I'm just returning the favor." Dr. Patel tilted her head. "You never talk about that." "Because it's not about me," Miguel replied and kept walking. The next morning, Daniel showed up at the hospital earlier than expected. He wore a smile that didn't reach his eyes, carrying a bouquet of roses that felt more like a performance than a gesture. Maria was sitting up in bed, the baby sleeping beside her in a bassinet. She glanced at the flowers, then at him. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," Daniel interrupted, setting them on the table. "And I wanted to apologize for last night. I was stressed. It wasn't about you." Maria's lips twitched into something that might have been a polite smile, but she said nothing. The silence was broken when Miguel stepped into the room with a fresh blanket for the baby. He gave Maria a small nod before noticing Daniel. Daniel's tone turned cold. "Don't you have floors to clean?" Miguel set the blanket down carefully. "Already done." Maria could feel the tension thickening the air, but before she could intervene, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "Miguel, you've got a visitor in the lobby." Miguel frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. Downstairs, the visitor turned out to be an older man in a crisp gray suit, his silver hair perfectly combed. His presence was at odds with the hospital's humdrum atmosphere. "Miguel Reyes?" the man asked, offering a hand. "Name S. Harold. I used to work with your father." Miguel's posture stiffened. "That was a long time ago." The man smiled faintly. "Long enough that some people might not know you weren't always pushing a mop." Upstairs, Daniel had followed them halfway down the hall, staying just out of sight. He leaned against the wall, listening. Harold continued. Your father's estate is still tied up in probate, but the board asked me to let you know the shareholders have voted to reinstate your name on the company's trust. You'll have access to the accounts within the month. Miguel exhaled slowly. I told them I wasn't interested in. It's not about interest. It's about legacy. You're still your father's son. Daniel's brows drew together. Company, trust, accounts. He suddenly remembered the name Ray's Industries, a shipping empire he'd read about in financial pages years ago. Could it be the same family? Miguel's reply was quiet but firm. I'm not here for the money. I've got work to do here. Harold studied him for a moment, then nodded. You're just like your father, stubborn in the right ways. As the man left, Daniel stepped out from the corner. Ray's Industries. Miguel looked at him without surprise. Eavesdropping doesn't suit you. Daniel smirked. So the janitor is actually a prince. Does Maria know? That's not your business, Miguel said simply. Daniel's voice dropped, his smile sharpening. Oh, I think it is, because if she finds out you've been hiding who you are, maybe she'll wonder what else you're hiding. Miguel's expression didn't change, but there was steel in his voice. You can twist it however you want, but she already knows what kind of man you are. For the first time, Daniel found himself without a comeback. Upstairs, Maria watched from the window as Miguel crossed the parking lot, the early morning sun catching the faint lines of exhaustion on his face. She didn't know exactly what had passed between him and Daniel downstairs, but something in her gut told her the balance between them had shifted. Not because Miguel was wealthy, not because Daniel had learned it, but because Daniel now understood something dangerous. Miguel's presence wasn't charity. It was choice. Daniel didn't leave the hospital right away. Instead, he paced in the shadow of the parking lot's covered walkway, watching Miguel's figure fade into the distance. The knowledge that the man was heir to a fortune only deepened the sting of the doctor's words from the night before. Janitor or not, Miguel had been there for Maria when Daniel had not, and now Daniel knew he couldn't dismiss him as just another lowly hospital employee. By the time Daniel returned upstairs, he had decided on his angle. Maria was feeding the baby, her gaze soft as she traced the tiny lines of her daughter's face. She looked up when Daniel entered, but her expression was unreadable. He sat down beside her, leaning forward in what he hoped seemed like a concerned posture. You know that janitor, Miguel? Maria didn't look away from the baby. Yes, he's been kind to me. Daniel's mouth tightened. Kind, sure, but did you know he's been lying about who he really is? That caught her attention. Her eyes flicked toward him sharp. What do you mean? Daniel spread his hands like a man reluctantly forced into truth-telling. I overheard a conversation. Miguel's not some humble cleaner. He's the heir to Ray's Industries, you know, the shipping conglomerate. His family's worth millions. He's been hiding it. Maria absorbed this without the gasp or wide-eyed disbelief Daniel expected. Instead, she simply said, And, Daniel echoed, caught off guard. Don't you think it's strange? What kind of man plays poor, gets close to women by pretending to be one of them, only to... Maria cut him off. You mean the kind of man who stayed with me all night when my husband was too busy to show up. Her tone was calm, but the words landed like blows. Later that afternoon, Miguel returned with a fresh set of blankets. Daniel was still in the room, sitting in awkward silence while Maria rested. I hear congratulations are in order, Daniel said smoothly, his voice carrying a mocking lilt. Reinstated on the family trust, was it? Must be nice, slumming it here for the thrill. Miguel folded the blankets neatly. Some people work to feel useful, others just work at looking important. Daniel bristled. Does Maria know the truth about you? Yes, Miguel replied evenly. She knows enough. Daniel smirked at Maria. Enough to know why a billionaire's son pushes a mop. This time, Miguel set the blankets down and met Daniel's gaze without flinching. You want the story? Fine. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his words filled the room. My father built Ray's Industries from nothing. I was supposed to take over, but before I could, I made a mistake, trusted a partner who siphoned millions from our accounts. My father covered the loss, but it nearly broke him. He didn't speak to me for months. When he passed, I couldn't bring myself to sit in that office, pretending I belonged there. Miguel's eyes flickered toward Maria. So I started over, took the first honest work I could find. It happened to be here, sweeping floors, changing linens. The pay doesn't matter. What matters is the work is mine and no one else's name is on it. Maria's gaze was steady, but Daniel's was restless. You expect me to believe this is about honor, Daniel said, laughing without humor. You're hiding, playing the saint so people like Maria think you're some kind of savior. Miguel's jaw tightened. I'm not playing anything, and unlike you, I don't measure worth in dollars or excuses. Maria finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. Daniel, you've spent more time tearing him down in one afternoon than you've spent holding your daughter since she was born. Daniel turned to her, stunned. Maria. No, she said, shaking her head. You left me alone in the most frightening moment of my life. I don't care if Miguel's rich or poor. I care that he was there. The room was silent, except for the soft breathing of the baby. Daniel stood abruptly. Fine, believe what you want, but don't say I didn't warn you. He left without looking back, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Miguel lingered only long enough to set the blankets at the foot of the bed. I'm sorry you had to hear all that, he said. Maria's lips curved faintly. I'm not. It told me exactly what I needed to know. Miguel nodded, then excused himself, the door closing softly behind him. In the hallway, Daniel stopped near the elevators, pulling out his phone. If Miguel thought the matter was over, he was wrong. Daniel had contacts, people who could make a man's past mistakes look like present crimes. But for the first time, the thought of trying to ruin Miguel didn't feel entirely like victory. It felt like desperation. And desperation was a scent Miguel had already learned to recognize. Daniel didn't waste time. By the next morning, he was in his office, tie loosened, scrolling through his contacts with a single-minded determination. He found the name, Harper Gleason, an old acquaintance in tabloid media. Harper was the type who could turn a parking ticket into a political scandal if it sold papers. Daniel leaned back in his chair, speaking into the phone like a man about to do the world a favor. Harper, I've got a story for you. Billionaire's son moonlighting as a janitor in a public hospital. Sounds like charity, right? Except he's got a history, financial misconduct, family estrangement. Might be stealing hospital funds now. He could practically hear Harper's grin through the line. That's juicy, got proof. Daniel smiled coldly. Give me a day. That same morning, Miguel was making his usual rounds at the hospital, unaware of Daniel's scheming. Nurses greeted him warmly. Even the stern head nurse, Mrs. Kim, had grown used to his quiet efficiency. Maria had been discharged the night before, but Miguel found himself glancing at her empty bed whenever he passed the maternity ward. He told himself it was habit, but he knew it was something else. By mid-afternoon, Daniel appeared in the hospital lobby, carrying a sleek black briefcase. Miguel, he called, his voice smooth as oil. Mind if we talk? Miguel hesitated but nodded, following him into a quiet staff lounge. Daniel set the briefcase on the table and flipped it open. Inside was a neat folder of documents, or at least, what looked like them. I've been doing some digging, Daniel began, his tone casual. Seems you've had financial trouble in the past, enough to make a man desperate. Miguel didn't move, and desperation makes people do stupid things, Daniel continued. Like skimming hospital funds. You've got access to supply rooms, cleaning contracts, if someone looked closely enough. Miguel's voice was calm, but his eyes were like flint. You're threatening to accuse me of theft. Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. Not threatening, warning. Unless you walk away from Maria completely, this little narrative might hit the press. Miguel studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of the mouth that made Daniel's confidence falter. Interesting, Miguel said, because you're assuming the press wouldn't be more interested in you. Daniel laughed. I have nothing to hide. Miguel stepped closer, his voice dropping. You left your wife during childbirth for another woman. You tried to humiliate her in public, and you're about to fabricate evidence against a hospital employee. Do you know how fast that can turn into a libel case? Or how many people saw you storming out of here the other night? Daniel's jaw twitched. You wouldn't. I wouldn't have to, Miguel replied. The truth's enough. But Daniel wasn't finished. The next day, Harper's Outlet published the headline, Billionaire's son masquerades as hospital janitor, suspicion of misconduct under review. It spread fast, too fast for Miguel to mount a defense before whispers began. Patients eyed him differently. A few nurses avoided his gaze. Maria saw the headline while rocking her baby to sleep. Her chest tightened, not because she believed it, but because she knew exactly who had planted it. That evening she called Miguel. I saw the article. Miguel's voice was steady, but she could hear the weariness beneath it. It'll pass. I've been through worse. No, Maria said firmly. This isn't just about you. It's about what kind of man Daniel is, and I'm not letting him get away with it. 2 days later, the hospital's board convened a special meeting. Miguel had been summoned, though no formal charges had been filed. He entered the room prepared to defend himself, but found Maria already there, speaking to the chairwoman. And here are the screenshots, Maria was saying, handing over her phone. Text messages between Daniel and a journalist planning this smear. He was too arrogant to delete them from his backup account. Daniel, seated in the corner, went pale. Miguel glanced at Maria, a silent question in his eyes. She gave the faintest smile. Your janitor uniform has more integrity than his whole life. The chairwoman turned to Daniel. Is this true? Daniel opened his mouth, closed it again, then muttered something about misunderstandings. The board was not sympathetic. Not only was Miguel cleared of suspicion, but the hospital issued a public statement praising his service and condemning the false accusations. Within hours, the same outlets that had smeared him were printing retractions, and Daniel's name was trending for all the wrong reasons. As Miguel left the building that day, Maria caught up to him. You didn't have to defend me, Miguel said quietly. I wasn't defending you, Maria replied. I was defending the truth and maybe a little of my pride. They walked in silence for a moment before she added, Besides, Daniel's just made himself irrelevant. That's the sweetest revenge there is. Miguel allowed himself a small smile. For the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter. But both of them knew Daniel wasn't the type to lick his wounds quietly. Daniel had been publicly shamed, the hospital board had cleared Miguel, and the press had turned on him. But humiliation only sharpened his hunger for revenge. If Miguel couldn't be destroyed through scandal, then Daniel would go for the jugular, his money. Through an old business contact, Daniel obtained partial records of the Valdez Holdings Trust, the sprawling empire Miguel's family controlled quietly behind the scenes. It was common knowledge in certain circles that Miguel was the heir, but the details of the trust's offshore accounts, real estate portfolios, and silent partnerships were locked down like a vault. Daniel thought he had struck gold when he spotted a small subsidiary, Blue Water Logistics, that had recently been flagged for an internal audit. He called another contact, this one in corporate compliance. You'll want to hear this, Daniel said, feeding him a carefully fabricated story of financial fraud, connecting it to Miguel by name. If the leak was picked up by regulators, Daniel reasoned, even an unfounded investigation could freeze Valdez Holdings' accounts, and Miguel would be too busy scrambling to fight him. What Daniel didn't realize was that Blue Water Logistics wasn't just any subsidiary. It was a philanthropic shipping arm that moved medical supplies to underfunded clinics, a project Miguel had been personally overseeing for years. The internal audit wasn't a red flag. It was part of a transparent restructuring to expand operations. So when Daniel's anonymous tip reached the wrong inbox, it didn't quietly open a government file. It went straight to the Valdez Holdings legal team. 3 days later, Daniel received a letter hand-delivered to his office. The envelope bore the embossed silver crest of the Valdez family. Inside, in precise legal language, was a notice. He was being sued for defamation, malicious interference with business, and attempted corporate sabotage. The damages sought, $25 million. Daniel read the number 3 times. His mouth went dry. In a high-rise conference room overlooking the city, Miguel sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, flanked by 2 lawyers in charcoal suits. Daniel entered, flanked by his own attorney, looking distinctly less smug than usual. Miguel's voice was calm, almost polite. "Daniel, I thought it was time we spoke face to face without the gossip columns." Daniel tried for bravado. "You can't win this. It's just your word against mine." Miguel slid a folder across the table. Inside were email records, traced back to Daniel's IP address, detailing the fabricated allegations about Blue Water Logistics. "We don't need my word," Miguel said evenly. "We have evidence and witnesses." Then Miguel leaned forward, lowering his voice so only Daniel could hear. "You've been trying to ruin me because you can't stand that Maria has moved on. But here's the thing, she didn't leave you for me. She left you because you're small, and every stunt you pull just proves her right." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The lawyers began discussing settlement terms, but Miguel interrupted. "No, we're not settling. He wants to drag this out. We'll drag it out in public." Over the next 2 months, Daniel's name became synonymous with corporate sabotage. His business partners quietly pulled out of joint ventures. A lucrative real estate deal collapsed when investors feared association. The legal fees alone drained his accounts. By the time the case reached preliminary hearings, Daniel had sold his penthouse and 2 luxury cars to stay afloat. Miguel, meanwhile, barely broke stride. Blue Water Logistics expanded to 3 more countries. The press framed him as a philanthropic businessman who had survived a smear campaign and won. One rainy afternoon, Daniel found himself alone in his rented office, smaller, quieter, stripped of its former grandeur. A notification pinged on his laptop. It was a news alert. Valdez Holdings wins landmark defamation case. Damages to fund new children's hospital wing. Daniel stared at the headline. The case hadn't just bankrupted him. Miguel had turned the victory into charity. The contrast was unbearable. A week later, he spotted Maria outside a cafe, her baby in her arms. She saw him before he could turn away. For a moment, they just looked at each other. The years between them, the cruelty, the arrogance, the loss, seemed to settle like dust in the space between. "You destroyed yourself, Daniel," Maria said softly. "Miguel didn't have to." Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to say. She walked away without looking back, and Daniel, for the first time, felt the full weight of the fact that he had lost, not just to Miguel, but to himself.